Hello, young students of ancient history. Last time we were delving into the great world of classical mythology. And today we are going to, instead of looking at myth, we're going to look at the composition of the Greek social and political world. So the basic unit of all Greek society is the polis, meaning the sort of the city, say the city of Athens, and the land surrounding the polis. So here you can, in this photo, you can kind of see the city, and then there's sort of this demarcated area that is within the line. So Attica, or is the great land of, or the extended area of and under the political control of Athens. So Athens and the surrounding lands, and the same would be true of Corinth or Sparta or anywhere else. That it's the polis is the basic foundation of all Greek society, and it is the area that you would identify as you are being from, as well as where you voted and you were a citizen, right? That you were you belonged to this place, and that you had rights in this place, special rights that everyone else does not always have. And what made Greece unique? What made Greece special? Well, it is the advent of democracy. So demes are just simply the people, and kratos meaning power. So early on in the classical period, you see direct democracy, meaning that one male property-owning citizen, and this is a very limited democracy. Now, I can't say that that this is a totally egalitarian democratic state, because it is a only male voting base, as well as you have to own a certain amount of land to be able to vote. And eventually Athens and most the Greek city-states will move from this direct democracy to a republic, because they became so big it just simply became impossible for every single citizen to participate within government. And a republic is where you nominate someone to represent yourself. So eventually this is what Athens will do, is that they will elect someone. They will have smaller local elections, and then this person will go off to Athens and represent their interests, which the United States is a perfect example of a republic. So we will begin by looking at the Polis of Sparta. And until about 600 BC, Sparta is developing as it doesn't have this Spartan reputation, that it's a harsh militaristic state, and it has no art or anything of great cultural value, that they only value the warrior and this kind of thing. But rather we see a flourishing Greek polis that's like any of the other Greek polises that are developing art and writing and literature, culture, theater. But it was with the Spartan conquest of Messana, which is here I'll flip over to the map. So Sparta conquers this region here of Messana. And when they did this, it created a very unusual situation, in that the Spartans did something that was very untypical, and that was they enslaved their conquered peoples, the entire society, and they created a sub-state within Greater Sparta. So Sparta becomes a stratified and closed society, and Sparta then goes about doing internal colonization, that they, rather than look outwardly, they only looked inwardly, and that this massive slave population of that lived among them, they feared them. They feared that they would be overrun by them, much like in the American South. There's just constant fear that during the American Civil, or before the Civil War in the antebellum South, that the slave population would rise up and overthrow their masters. So Sparta has a very similar fear, that they were terrified. So therefore they become isolationists, that they don't want these people to hear anything about this Athenian democracy and egalitarianism. They don't want to hear anything about this. They close their borders to everyone else and become a very isolationist state. So in the period of classical Greece, Sparta is not like other polises. They are poli. Rather, they are unique in their organization, in that they are not a democracy in nearly in the same sense that any other Greek polis is. So Sparta has two kings, one that was a great war leader and one that was kind of a politician, a domestic leader. Then there's a very small council of 5 oligarchs called the ephors, and they are elected by the assembly of adult males, who, if you own certain property qualifications and you can serve in the army, then you can vote in Sparta. And this these are the kind of the mechanisms that ran Sparta. Now there is a council of 30 that helps the kings do administrative things, but really the great power is within the kings and the ephors, and this great assembly that votes on a few things, but not in the sense that Athens has, where you would decide on laws and that sort of thing. But the kings, again, don't have unlimited power. But there are here this thing in order to be a member of this assembly of all adult males with certain qualifications, you have to have citizenship within Sparta. So there are different kinds of citizenship within Sparta. For if you are a Spartiate, you are the equals, the meaning that you are a property-owning male who is capable of serving in the army. If you cannot do both of these things, then you will not be a Spartiate. So then they have the inferior, which is a citizen that simply lost their property qualification. And then you have sort of neighbors, and these are these people that live outside of Sparta, or live not in Sparta, the actual city, but lived outside of it, but they could still serve in the army. So if you don't actually live in Sparta, you don't have a property qualification, then you have to be able to serve in the army. So if you don't actually live in the Polis of Sparta, you can still serve in the army, you just cannot be a full citizen and vote in their elections. And then you sort of have this serf class of just poor laborers, and then of course slaves, which is by far the vast majority of people, and they have absolutely no rights. So the Sparta is most famous for their military, and they fight in this massive formation here called a phalanx. And this is kind of like a hedgehog that moves forward with a shield wall, and it's just a devastating way of fighting. It's like a tank, and you are not just, the front line is not who's doing the fighting, but everybody behind you is pushing behind you, and you just literally push people off the battlefield. And that is what makes the phalanx such a devastating formation, and because no one else fought like this other than the Greeks, or at least fought as well as this. And Sparta, they have the greatest army within the Greek world. And why do they have the greatest army? Because they're terrified of the slaves, and therefore they send their young men from the time that they are 7 years old. They are sent away to be trained to be in the army. And there's a famous saying that a Spartan mother tells her son when she goes away, or when he goes away. He says, you will either come home carrying your shield or being carried upon your shield, meaning that you will either have victory or you will be dead. Otherwise, you are dead to me. And these Spartan boys were trained in extreme physical prowess, that they were just amazingly well-trained soldiers. Now, moving away from just Sparta in general and speaking more to the rest of the Greek world, and specifically kind of to Athens, tyranny was always a problem within democracies. Anytime that you could vote, what if somebody could not garner enough votes in order to be elected? Well, when we think of tyrants, we typically have a very bad view of something, but a tyrant in the Greek world is not always a bad thing. It just simply means you were not legitimately elected and you hold power. So anytime in Athens, for instance, when they are unable to elect an archon, which is the chief magistrate, think of it as kind of the president of the United States, um, it is called anarchy or anarcheia, meaning you don't have the ability to elect an archon. Therefore, a tyrant has to rule, somebody who was not legitimately elected. Now, one of these tyrants, whose name was Pisistratus, he is responsible for building the Agora, which is the great market in Greece. He constructed the first aqueduct for the people in Athens. He created numerous good trade policies that helped generate enormous amounts of money through economics, olive growing specifically, as well as offering loans, public loans with no interest to poorer citizens so they could buy farmland, so they could participate within the state. And land that was confiscated from criminals, he gave to the poor in order to create more farms. And he held up the laws of Athens very well. This man was a tyrant because he was not elected, but he did enormous amount of good things. So being a tyrant in the ancient Greek world is not always a bad thing. Now, there could be bad tyrants along with good tyrants, but tyrant does not always mean bad. So the last tyrant in Greece, they were run off in 509. In Athens, the last tyrant was run off in 509, and from that point forward, there is only for the most part, only elected people, or legitimately elected archons and rulers. So there's going to be several reforms within the Greek, and specifically here I'm talking about Athens, electoral system, and these are, first of all, the reforms of Solon, and Solon was a great Greek Athenian statesman, and Solon is elected archon, and he advocates for a written constitution. It's very good to have a written constitution simply because then everyone knows exactly what the laws are. And by knowing what the laws are, therefore you can argue in court. And he creates some new administrative units that changed how voting was held and what office you can hold. So you need to be fairly rich to hold a higher office. And I've put some of these the names of these various things, and I'll let you do that. But you can enjoy these with pleasure. But again, the more grain that you have equals the higher office that you can hold. And Solon had many reforms within his system, or within his archonship, that he made debt bondage, for instance, illegal. And by making debt bondage illegal, therefore it got anyone who was a citizen out of slavery. Because if you became indebted, you could sell yourself into slavery, and therefore you lost your rights to vote. And it was very difficult for you to get out of debt, even once you had sold yourself into slavery. So, one thing he really tried to do was to level the playing field for citizens. I would note to you that he really tried to help many people get out of slavery and servitude. Now, I always struggle to say Cleisthenes, but another great reformer within the Athenian system is Cleisthenes. And I usually refer to him as C during lectures because I just struggle so much with his name. But C here transitions Athens into a republic. Solon's reforms, as wonderful as they were, Athens still remained a direct democracy where every male landowning citizen of a certain property qualification could vote and came and had to participate. C changes things, and Athens then becomes a republic because Athens was just simply getting too big in order for everyone to participate within their system that they expanded. Now, Sparta was inward looking. Athens is outward looking. They are trying to expand their base of power beyond just the Athens proper. And therefore, they create this system where everyone's going to vote in their deme election, and then you are going to elect your local representative in your regional area. And then you're going to each one of these, and of course, you have 150 demes total within the three major regions of Athens. So the city proper, Attica, and then the coastal lands. So each one of these is then going to send 10 people, and they're eventually going to end up in a council of 500 who votes on all things. And this is both the Congress, Senate, and Supreme Court of all things. So the Boule is the ultimate power in the Athenian state, that it will vote on people's execution. A citizen being executed, you will stand trial before the Council of 500, and you will, and that is where laws are legislated, speeches are made, and it is directed and led by the Archon. So he's kind of the president of this, but has some great powers. But anyway, you can see how the Athenian system works here. So beyond politics, Athenian drama is what Greece is really famous for. And it's not like our modern plays where you have tons of actors. If you've seen the great play Hamilton, you know, where you have tons of actors and music going on and things like this. Ancient theater was something that started at dawn and went till dusk. And it was very simple, and there were not many actors, and there's basically 3 actors within most plays, and people would come and they would attend these things for weeks, and they would revel and feast in the evening, but they were the plays were often designed to teach great moral lessons, as well as entertain people. But then in the evening, the statesmen and citizens would come together, and they would debate, and deals would be made, and things like this. But you can see here many of the great playwrights and some of the more famous plays, such as Oedipus Rex, where it's tragedies, and most of the famous Greek plays are indeed tragedies, because this is what it teaches us, that wisdom only comes through suffering, one of the key hallmarks of Greek civilization. But you can see here it's some of the Japanese kabuki theater, that this is very similar to what Greek theater would have been like, where these exaggerated masks and there is much exaggerated movement of the hands and arms. It's not like our own theater, and the closest thing you really have today is Japanese kabuki. And we also look at classical architecture here for a moment. And the Greeks heavily influenced the Western world. The Romans as well adopted Grecian architecture. And there are several different styles. It's not all that important that you know the difference between a Doric and Ionic type of column. But they get grander as time goes on. But simply that this architecture, this style of architecture began, and if you have ever walked on the Capitol Mall in Washington, D.C., every building basically in the United States Capitol is founded upon this Greek model that comes through the Roman world. So the Greeks still live with us in that our Supreme Court, our nation's capital, are built in the same style that were created by these Greeks, that allowed them to have these vast open spaces through columns, and they constructed these massive temples by using their new styles of architecture. And they were also incredible artists in that they had time, they had the ability to perfect this kind of carving. These are the Elgin marbles up here. You can, if you go strangely, they're not in Greece. They're actually in the museum in London, and you can go see them there. But you can see here just the incredible artistic beauty that the Greeks were able to create in these statues. So, as time carried on in classical Greece, a great power arose within the ancient Near East. Again, another one of these nomadic empires. These Achaemenid peoples descend out of the steppes of Asia and conquered all of Mesopotamia and much of the Near East, and these eventually become the Medo-Persians. And one of their most famous kings here is Cyrus the Great, who we have met before. But the Persians become the truly great empire of this period. Classical Greece is sort of, I don't want to say a backwater, but it's certainly on the periphery of the world. That they are not the great superpower in the ancient world. It is Persia, in their great capital of Persepolis. And the title of the Persian king is King of Kings. He's really an emperor. He has no second on earth and controls enormous amounts of land. The Persians had a very unique religion, almost is more similar to Judaism or Christianity than anything else in the world, which is called Zoroastrianism. And they believed in almost a monotheistic concept of God through Ahura Mazda, the great and powerful, who encourages them to, by fire and by sword, to descend across the lands, spreading their religion, communicated through the prophet Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, and which the religion is named after. But for our purposes, we'll be looking at the kingship of Darius and Xerxes, who followed Cyrus the Great, so fondly remembered within Jewish scriptures. So the Greeks on Iona decided that they did not like their Persian satrap overlords, so they set fire to the city and killed a lot of people, and this brought the Greeks into conflict with the Persians, and the Greeks kind of, at times of great crisis, when an external force comes to attack them, they will come together. That all the city-states will come together at Delphi, or Olympia, and they will unite into one great coalition of Greek warriors. And for the first time, this happened. That the Persian Emperor Darius sends troops to put Greece back in line. After they had set Sardis on fire. And they finally meet the combined Greek armies at the Battle of Marathon, and the Greeks win an incredible victory. And the warriors at Marathon kind of have this reputation like the American soldiers who fought on D-Day, that if you are a man of Marathon, you paid no more taxes. That if you fought on the field of Marathon, you never had to pay taxes ever again anywhere in Greece. You had special clothing that you could wear, a badge that showed you were at Marathon. And this was a stunning victory. I've often said this would be like the U.S. Army showing up with all its might and power to somewhere in Kazakhstan, let's say, and being soundly defeated. It would have been unbelievable. This is something that was just unbelievable in the ancient world. And Greece knows that this was kind of an expeditionary force by the Persians, so they form the Delian League. And this is 31 Greek city-states that come together to resist Persia. And eventually the Persians indeed show back up, and this is Xerxes, right? Poor Darius has passed away, and his son Xerxes shows up, humiliated, says, I'm going to teach these Greeks a lesson, and shows up, Herodotus tells us, the great historian, with an army of 1,000,000 men. This is an absurd exaggeration. So Xerxes probably shows up with 100,000 or even less than that. Numbers are always vastly exaggerated. And this is where the famous story of the Battle of Thermopylae comes into play, that the Greeks decide that they are going to go north and they're going to meet the Persians, and they kind of dither around and they say, no, we're going to retreat farther, we're going to retreat farther, we're going to retreat farther. And the Spartans, they would not commit their army to this struggle at this point, because Sparta has no walls. So if they send their army out, they have no protection. But they would not commit their army. But the king Leonidas and his 300-person bodyguard go to represent Sparta against these Persians in the north. And eventually, Greece decides to retreat farther, and they were going to in order to save the Greek army, 300 Spartans at the pass of Thermopylae, which is it's a very narrow corridor here. So it's a very narrow neck that it nullifies the number of the Persians, and 300 Spartans for 3 days basically hold off, let's say 100,000 Persians. And the Spartans are, of course, killed to the last man, but it's a great story of just a heroic victory, immortalized within Western culture. Or it's actually a crushing loss for the Spartans, but the moral victory of it, that it took, the Persians could not, that only 300 Spartans could hold off so many Persians, was just an incredible victory. And finally at the battle, or not finally, but then at Salamis, there was a great victory by the Athenian statesman and admiral Themistocles, who went to the Oracle of Delphi, and they said, the oracle said, make your stand behind the walls of wood, which Themistocles interpreted as meaning our navy, and not the wooden walls in Athens. So some poor people thought it meant that we get behind the wooden walls up on the highest hill in Athens, where the temple of Zeus is, or the temple of all the gods are, at the Parthenon. And they were all, of course, wiped out by the Persian army. But Themistocles defeats the Persian navy, which keeps the Persians from being resupplied by sea. And finally, the Greeks, through some wrangling by their own officers, perhaps, meet the Persians at Plataea, the Great Battle of Plataea, where the Greeks defeat the best army that the Persians had to offer, and soundly defeat the Persians. And this is really truly the arrival of the Greeks on the world stage as a world power, that they have defeated the armies of the Great Persian Empire. And here you can see some of these battles. And wouldn't you know it, as Athens is the leader of, and Athens and Sparta as leaders of the Greek city-states that each having great influence. Athens was the kind of chair and leader of the Delian League, and Sparta was leader of this other league called the Peloponnesian League, which are forms of the Peloponnese Islands. Here are all the islands out in Greece. And they came quickly into conflict after the defeat of the Persian threat. And this enters a period of about 20 years that we call the Peloponnesian Wars, which is just meaning the Greek Civil Wars. And Athens had something of an empire. All of this area you can see is controlled by Athens, and then Sparta sort of decides it's going to have to expand. And Sparta is eventually, it loses at first. because of the superior monetary resources of Athens. Athens has a vastly better economy. Its empire is huge, and its great leader Pericles, the great statesman, he says, you don't fight the Spartans in the field. You never fight the greatest warriors in the field. You do guerrilla-style warfare. You hit and run, and you put your money into your navy, and you starve Sparta out. And as long as Pericles was alive, this was the policy of Athens, and Athens wins. But then, with his death, there's several people who advocate, such as Alcibiades, the famous and good-looking youth, and other conservative leaders of the Athenian faction that lead Athens into actually fighting open wars with Sparta, and eventually they simply lose. And they also they use their resources stupidly, and they try to expand their empire vastly beyond the means that they have, and this leads Sparta to eventually conquer Athens. And Athens is remembered as the year of the 30 tyrants, because this is the Council of 30 in Sparta come to rule over Athens. So eventually this is the end of the Athenian supremacy and the end of the Peloponnesian Wars. But eventually Sparta decides it really cannot control this area. It kind of goes back, and then you see the rise of other Greek city-states. But really this is when you see a new arrival, and that is Philip of Macedon. And this Macedon is in northern Greece here, who is the father of Alexander the Great, who conquers all of Greece, all of Persia, and all the world. So I will leave us here for the time being, and I hope you have come to see sort of the evolution here of the Greek polis through the city-states, and the development of Greek civilization, and the preeminence, the coming of power of Greece in the ancient world, and the factors that led to the collapse of this great Athenian democracy. Until next time, stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.